Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Unlocking Biomethane for Decarbonisation in Southeast Asia, Perspectives from Malaysia and Indonesia, organized by the Climate Change in Southeast Asia program at ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. I'm Jia Hui, your MC for today. Before we begin, I would like to go over a few housekeeping matters. Firstly, please note that this webinar is not under the Chatham House rule, and the recording will be uploaded on YouTube after the event. Next, if you encounter any technical issues, please use the chat function to reach out to our technical support team. To ask questions to the speakers, please use the Q&A function, stating your name and affiliation together with your question, as well as which speaker you would like to direct your question to. You can send in your questions at any time. Lastly, if you would like to stay informed on our future activities, please sign up for updates at the links which I will be sharing in the chat box. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator for the session. Dr. Christopher Len is Senior Fellow and Acting Coordinator at the Climate Change in Southeast Asia program here at ISEAS. I will now invite him to begin the webinar. Dr. Len, please.
Thank you, Jia Hui. Good morning, everyone. My name is Christopher Len. I'm a Senior Fellow and Acting Coordinator for the Climate Change in Southeast Asia at the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. I will be the moderator for this session. Today's seminar is about unlocking biomethane for decarbonization in Southeast Asia with a specific focus on the perspectives from Malaysia and Indonesia. We are going to look at what is happening in these two key markets and also learn about the broader role biomethane can play in our region's energy transition. We will also explore the opportunities and challenges for scaling up biomethane, including its potential for cross-border trade and export. I'm delighted to have three highly distinguished experts who will be speaking. Our event today is structured in three parts, with each speaker covering a distinct segment of the topic. The first speaker is Mr. Kevin Loh, a principal at Blue Nomi, a strategic advisory boutique focused on the climate transition. Kevin leads the team's activities on low-carbon fuels in the APAC region, especially in bioenergy. To set the scene, Kevin will provide a macro-level overview of biomethane's use case in the context of our broader decarbonization goals. Next, moving to the supply side, we have Mr. Thomas Wagner, the Chief Representative of the German Envitec Biogas Group in Southeast Asia. Thomas will share his on-the-ground insights into biomethane production in Malaysia and Indonesia, drawing on his extensive experience building and operating bioplants. He has extensive experience in the biogas and biomethane industry, including building Indonesia's first independent power producer from biogas. Thomas is also head of the Energy Working Group at European Business Chamber of Commerce in Indonesia and a founding member of the Indonesian Biogas Association, as well as the Indonesian Biomethane Society. And finally, to discuss the demand side, we welcome Mr. Dieter Billen, a partner at Roland Berger and head of the firm's energy practice in Southeast Asia. Dieter has been based in Malaysia for the past 15 years. He has worked on over 15 biomethane-related projects in the region, including with the Singapore government on biomethane imports. He will focus on the crucial topic of export markets for biomethane from Malaysia and Indonesia, discussing the commercial and strategic aspects needed to make this trade a reality. For this webinar, each speaker will be given 15 to 20 minutes for their presentation, which will take us up to about 11 o'clock. After that, we will have our Q&A session. Now is the time for our panelists to make their presentations. Kevin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chris. Let me just share my screen first. Can you see my slides? I think it's all clear. First of all, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, depending on where you are. Thank you, Chris and Jiahui and ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute team for having me and putting together this webinar at a very relevant time. It's my privilege to help set the stage for the conversation today. First, a quick one on Bluenemy. We are a specialist advisory firm focused on energy and climate. We were founded in 2007, and since then we've been working on a variety of bioenergy topics within the energy climate subset. And over the years, we've been involved in several industry-level projects in France for biomethane, on gas contracting, on the grid injections, as well as methodologies associated with carbon accounting. We've also co-authored the National Bioenergy Roadmap in Australia, and worked with a lot of gas distribution networks in France, UK, Australia, and New Zealand. And because of that experience, we've actually over the past few years completed over 50 due diligence projects on biomethane production facilities, mainly in Europe, to support them in terms of investments, transactions, and capital raising. Now, maybe we start off with the question of what exactly is biomethane. It's a renewable fuel, a low carbon fuel that is produced from the anaerobic digestion of organic matter. So you can see here, when you keep organic matter basically in the right conditions, which is the absence of oxygen, it produces methane over time. So this occurs naturally because of the microbes that exist within the organic matter. So in Southeast Asia, for example, there are palm oil mills, affluent lagoons, there are landfills, and all of this are actually constantly releasing methane gas into the atmosphere, mixed with other gaseous products, co-products. And at the same time, when you actually take some of this agricultural feedstock that I've shown here, rice husk, corn stalk, and even manure, if you keep them in a sealed chamber, over time it actually produces this gas mixture, which we call biogas. And you might already know biogas from direct combustion into power, but when you upgrade it, when you purify it, biogas, which is typically a mixture of carbon dioxide and methane, you can attain 95 to 99% purity methane, which meets the natural gas pipeline specification. So that makes it almost, a drop-in substitute for natural gas, and it allows us to actually decarbonize natural gas use. Based on our high-level estimates, the agricultural sector in Southeast Asia alone, so this is not including your industrial waste and so on, is able to produce about 2,700 petajoules of biomethane per annum. So the amount of feedstock that is produced from the waste, not dedicated energy crop, just the waste. And this almost equivalent to half of Southeast Asia's current annual electricity demand. So this is very, very significant for Southeast Asia. And what then are the benefits? We talk about it being low carbon. How can it contribute to the environment broadly? So first, there is the opportunity for greenhouse gas emissions reduction. First, in terms of direct methane emissions. So in case you don't know, methane itself is actually a greenhouse gas. It actually has more than 25 times the global warming potential of CO2. So being able to capture it from landfills, from some of these homemade affluent ponds, actually already reduces greenhouse gas emissions directly. Moreover, when we then take this captured methane and use it to displace natural gas, whether it's in electricity production or as a fuel, we're actually displacing the amount of fossil CO2 emissions, and that actually reduces the amount of emissions overall in our energy system. More than that, the CO2, which I mentioned just now, when you purify biogas to produce biomethane, that CO2 can actually be used as well, and it's biogenic, and that CO2 can displace fossil carbon dioxide, typically used to produce carbonated beverages and to in some of the food processes, including decaffeinating coffee beans. So that helps to reduce fossil emissions further. What's really beautiful about biomethane production is that waste management is essentially integrated into it. So when you produce biomethane, you are actually supporting part of that waste management process that happens in our cities, in our industries, in agricultural setting as well. So from an urban perspective, production of biomethane actually gives the potential of diverting landfill organic waste, and that reduces methane emissions from landfills. It also improves operations at landfills because you don't have to worry so much about landfill fires, and that reduces the risk in some of this waste value chain. At the same time, for the longest time, I mean, wastewater have already incorporated biogas production in their process, and so biomethane, which is a derived product from that process, actually contributes to waste management. On the agricultural side, typically a lot of this agricultural residue is actually burned either on site in the fields or in the aggregation points, a rice mill or a processing facility. By diverting some of this residue to anaerobic digestion facility, you're actually reducing open burning, reducing air pollution, and that of course directly contributes to air quality, reduces again carbon emissions into the air directly, and at the same time, when you are anaerobically digesting this feedstocks, you actually produce as a byproduct a digestate slurry. And this digestate slurry is widely deployed as a nutrient-rich organic fertilizer because it depends on what your feedstock is. But when it comes to agricultural residue, that plays a huge part. So we've heard about how biomethane production and use can contribute to the environmental perspective. How does this actually come into play in our energy ecosystem? Biomethane is very versatile. I mentioned that it's a drop-in substitute for natural gas, and natural gas is widely used across power production, across the maritime industry. Biomethane in particular, because of its low carbon attribute, allows us to essentially decarbonize our power production. And this is baseload power production, so we're not talking about intermittent renewables, right? So it's a renewable form of energy that when you inject into the gas grid and use it in your CCGT, GTs, that actually contributes to greening our gas and electricity grid. And I think I'll let Dieter speak more about the Singapore import pilot for biomethane later. In the maritime space, LNG is currently widely touted as the de facto emissions reducing fuel with the new frameworks in place. Now, biomethane, being exactly identical chemically to natural gas, can be liquefied into bio-LNG essentially, and that can feed into some of our fleet of LNG fuel vessels. So an example here, PaxOcean, one of the vessel makers and designers, they just delivered some LNG powered harbor crafts to Indonesia, and that sort of boats, of course, can be fueled using bio LNG. There are larger vessels by the likes of CMA that is on the order books, Maersk as well. They've all ordered LNG fueled vessels that can actually use bio LNG in their operations in order to reduce emissions further. Now, aviation fuel is an interesting one. So we hear about SAF a lot. We hear about the process of using used cooking oil for production of aviation fuel, A1 jet fuel. But did you know that actually biomethane can also be reformed, synthesized into jet fuel? So we have in Singapore a collaboration that was announced quite recently between Aster, so Chandra Asri, and Adder Fuels. They're looking at producing SAF in a facility at Jurong Island where they take industrial waste, so a lot of off gas. Some of this could be biogas as well, so biomethane, and that produces SAF. We have examples across the other side of the world, in US, where Sky NRG is doing the same in the US. So biomethane itself also can help to decarbonize the aviation sector. And finally, I think just to give a land transport-based example, there are already fleets of natural gas fuel vehicles around, and that in Southeast Asia, and that can be further decarbonized using biomethane. So from an energy use case perspective, it's very clear. Biomethane replaces natural gas, and in that process, basically neutralizes the carbon emissions from natural gas when you use it in the existing fleet of infrastructure, as well as engines and end use equipments. Now, on the other side, the non-energy use, natural gas by itself is already used as a chemical feedstock. It's already used for hydrogen production. And this is where biomethane, once again, can come in to replace that process. BASF, for example, in China, they've actually signed an offtake agreement for biomethane from one of the state-owned enterprise to actually use this biomethane in their chemical process to produce chemical materials. In this case, specialized coatings and foams, and probably as a subset of that as well, hydrogen. So biomethane, when you put it through steam methane reforming, which is the typical process, is de facto standard in petchem industry for producing hydrogen. When you put biomethane into that process, you're actually producing green hydrogen. So you're producing green hydrogen without even using electrolyzers and all. And that's probably a relatively cost-effective way of producing that at this point of time. And you've got gas infrastructure company in Europe that is actually doing this to obtain hydrogen for their process, and that way that hydrogen is actually green, right? So it's GHG emissions free. And finally, CO2, I mentioned earlier that CO2 that is produced from purification of biogas can further be cleaned up and used for beverages. So even your dry ice, which is made from carbon dioxide, that can be used from this process. In Europe, this is getting more and more common in this part of the world. Still not attempted, but with these projects that are coming off from the biomethane imports in Singapore, hopefully in the region, we're going to see this as well. Now, what has this all got to do with Southeast Asia? Like I mentioned earlier about the potential bioresource in Southeast Asia, this is huge. And when you translate into electricity terms here, we see that the potential compared to the installed capacity for utilizing this potential is really huge. Is many times more. Of course, there are tricky challenges which I'll let my fellow panelists share a bit more about. But if you zoom into individual countries, again, you've got countries like Thailand, Vietnam, which are looking at importing LNG, for example, but they themselves have actually huge potential to extract biomethane from domestic feedstock, and that can actually hugely contribute to some of the energy security. And that's more relevant now than ever, right? In Europe, the biomethane industry really took off, especially during the Ukraine war, because gas prices skyrocketed. And now that we're seeing challenges in the world that has once again put pressure on gas prices, hopefully this gives us a good window for us to see that this is an opportunity to start building up that supply chain, building up this utilization infrastructure for this resource that's actually already in our backyard, right? I hope this set a good context for our two further speakers to share their perspective on the market and supply market supply and demand for biomethane, especially for Malaysia and Indonesia. And I hand over the time back to Chris.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for providing an overview of the production and use of biomethane from an environmental perspective and in the energy ecosystem. It's really important to set the context, and I think you did a very good job in letting the audience have a better understanding on its application in power production, in the transportation sector, and its role in non-energy industrial applications. And I think it's also very useful that you have pointed out that Southeast Asia has significant future potential for biogas and biomethane, and that only 1% of that potential has been developed, which means that more can be done to unlock this resource. So thank you very much. And now we will move on to the second speaker. Thomas, the floor is now yours. Thank you.
All right. I suppose you can hear me now.
Yes, we can.
All right. Thank you very much, Chris, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I don't need to introduce myself again. Chris thankfully already did that much more nicely than I would have done it myself. So just one quick slide on the company background, not so much for advertising reasons, but more because it drives home the fact that things like what Kevin just mentioned already happen elsewhere in the world. So NVTech has been established about 22 years ago as a now listed company. We do EPC, gas upgrading systems, and also own biogas plant operations. But the own operation is only in Europe. We operate almost 90 plants, and some of them already supply LNG to shipping in the Baltics. We already operate 15 LNG filling stations for long distance trucking as NVTech, so as part of our own supply chain from our own biogas plants. We already produce liquid CO2 for the beverage sector. And of course, we also already inject biomethane in many locations into the gas grid. So in Europe, all of what Kevin just mentioned is already reality. Albeit, of course, especially the LNG space has only been developed the last 3 years or so. So there's still a lot of things happening there. So with that having said, I have a few slides to drive home a few specific points that Kevin already raised. So I will just flip through that quickly just to make sure everybody's on the same page. So he already mentioned that biomethane or biogas is about 40% CO2 and 60% methane. From wet biomass and tanks, so it's important we cannot use wood. It's all wet or liquid material, but very important to understand that it doesn't have to be liquid. I'm saying that because in Southeast Asia, biogas is always associated with wastewater. For historical reasons I don't need to dive into. There is much more potential actually from solid waste, solid municipal organic waste, industrial waste, and in Indonesia, especially from the palm oil sector, the empty fruit bunches, which are also not really utilized yet. So all of those things have additional potential, but they are entirely not utilized because for lack of market currently, or the market only being developed now. So wet process, not wood, and solid, liquid as well as solid materials. That's important to remember. Now, we have 60% methane and 40% CO2. That can be used already in gensets or steam power plants, but we can separate the two. And after we separate the two, we have almost pure methane on one side and almost pure CO2 on the other side. And it's really important to remember that 97% methane is the same molecule as what you already have in the natural gas grid now. So it's not like we have biodiesel and diesel, which are slightly different molecules, and you have to adjust engine technology and so on. It's exactly the same thing. It's just a different source. So there's no switching effort required on the consumer side. And of course, it also means biomethane can be used for anything that you use natural gas for. On the other side, we have pure CO2, which currently is usually not really used because it's only relatively small volume, about 10 tons per site or so. But it should definitely be used because if you think about it, there are projects that do direct air capture where you try and capture 0.2% CO2 from the atmosphere, while at other places where we do gas upgrading, we basically just vent 99% methane instead of, CO2 instead of using it. Only problem is logistics, so it can be used if there is a purpose nearby. Also, what's often not understood by people who don't work in this space all the time is why is it even carbon neutral or renewable? Because of course, if you burn methane, you also produce CO2 in the process. The key difference is that the CO2 we produce in the process is also there in the natural process. So normally we have sunlight and atmosphere producing biomass by photosynthesis. So CO2 is taken from the atmosphere and turned into leaves or wood or food. When that dies, it also degrades again into CO2 and we have a closed cycle. So the CO2 is coming from the atmosphere and going back to the atmosphere. If we now produce biogas or use it in the biomaterial and biomass power plants, we do the same thing. We turn the carbon into CO2, but in a useful way. So my point is the CO2 emitted from biogas power plants, from biomass power plants, from burning biomethanol produced from biomethane and so on, that CO2 has been taken from the atmosphere before and is now just being put back where it has always been. Whereas if we use natural gas or coal, that is additional carbon that hasn't been in the atmosphere for the last 200 or so million years. So that is the core difference here. Putting additional CO2 into the atmosphere or putting CO2 into the atmosphere that you have taken from the atmosphere before. Really important point to understand why this even makes sense. Last point on this general thing, a few misconceptions I run into is, again, biogas is also from solid, not only from liquid feedstock. Then if we use the biomass for biogas production, all the fertilizer value is still there. So very often manure, empty fruit bunches, pome from palm oil industry and so on is used for fertigation or for mulching in the field. All of those nutrients are still available after the biogas process because we only take out carbon, not magnesia, nitrogen, phosphate, and so on. And there's also a lot of confusion about pome being used for sustainable aviation fuel or biodiesel. That's actually not true. So everybody is talking about using pome for that, but in reality, it's only the oil separated from pome. So pome is palm oil mill effluent, it's wastewater. Of course, nobody is producing biodiesel from water. What they do is they take out the small percentage of oil, 1–2% or so, from that wastewater and turn that into biodiesel. Of course, if we take out the oil residue from the pome, we can produce less gas from the pome, but the pome is still there and it can still be used for biogas production, even if it is also used for biodiesel. So there is no real competition between the two applications. Really important. So the pome is not gone just because of sustainable aviation fuel. So now, with that having said, the key for unlocking the biomethane potential is where is the market for the biomethane? Nobody will produce it if we can't sell it. And Dieter will dive a little bit more into that. Just for general understanding, Indonesia and Malaysia both do not have a domestic market for biomethane. They do have a domestic market for natural gas, and if you can provide biomethane at the same price, there is a market, except you can't provide it at the same price usually. So that's why everybody is looking at exporting biomethane now. And the export opportunities are in the maritime sector. So there are hopefully targets for international shipping to reduce CO2 emissions. That can be done by using LNG or bio-LNG. We have Fuel EU Maritime, which is a similar regulation for the European Union. We have targets by the Japanese Gas Association to turn their consumption into renewable gas. We have a similar, slightly less ambitious policy in Korea. We have the Refuel Aviation for sustainable aviation fuel in Europe, and we have corporate targets, usually under RE100, to reduce corporate carbon emissions. And I just noticed that some of these logos have been flipped over. I'm not sure how that happened. So now, also Kevin already mentioned the potential. We are mostly interested as Envitec, we are mostly interested in Southeast Asia in the palm oil sector. Why is that? Because the palm oil sector resolves all the logistics issues. Every palm oil mill already has potential for a significant sized biogas plant around 4 or 5 megawatt electrical efficiency combined. So there is no need to bring biomass to collect it. It's all coming straight from the mill. And when we talk about 60-ton mills, those are really nice biogas plant sizes for POME and EFB. The total potential, and on the map you see mill locations in Indonesia, is roughly 280 million MMBTU per year just from that sector. And if we price that somewhere between $13 to $26 per MMBTU, the revenue potential from that is somewhere between $4 and $8 billion US per year. But $13 to $26 is not something a domestic market will pay, which is why everybody is looking for the export market, and for just natural gas prices, most projects are not really viable. Similarly in Malaysia, again, a map with the palm oil mill locations. The potential is smaller, around 115 million MMBTU per year. Also, we have a split market in Sabah, Sarawak, and Peninsular Malaysia. Those markets are very different by infrastructure as well. Again, 1.5 to 3 million $1 billion potential. Again, domestic prices are too low and sometimes even subsidized. So how to get it into markets where we do have viable prices? So most of the time in the world, the problem is we do have demand for biomethane, but we don't know how to produce it because biomass is expensive or not enough waste is around. In Southeast Asia, the situation is exactly flipped around. We are basically drowning in biomass, but we don't really know what to do with the methane we can produce from it, except we export it to the markets where there is demand. So that's the whole spiel in Southeast Asia, getting the gas we can produce here to the places where people are willing to pay for it. And what are the avenues? So in Indonesia, we have underutilized, same actually applies to Malaysia, underutilized pipeline systems because gas fields are increasingly depleted. So there is space in the pipelines. We have existing liquefaction infrastructure, for example, here in Bontang. Indonesia, as well as Malaysia, are reducing their export quota for natural gas to markets like Japan, Korea, and so on. So there is less gas available to export, which means importing countries are looking for alternative supply. And Japan is one of the most strongest driver in Indonesia and Malaysia right now to develop a market for biomethane to replace depleting natural gas coming from these markets. So we have LNG facilities, we have Singapore and Java as potential pipeline destinations, and we have the Straits of Malacca as the world's largest bunkering hub for LNG, as well as methanol production capacity in Bontang. So also methanol can be produced from biomethane, because biomethane, same as natural gas, we can just switch it. Same in Malaysia, Straits of Malacca, pipeline destinations, and in Sabah, Sarawak, a lot of LNG and methanol infrastructure already existing. It's just a matter of getting the gas there to then export it. So now how to untap that potential? Key is infrastructure. So we know where to get the biomass. We know how to produce biomethane from that biomass. We know how to compress it, to upgrade it, to liquefy it, to inject in the pipeline, and so on. The key is getting it to Japan, to Singapore, to Europe, to shipping, to get significant pricing for that. And for that, we need volume. You cannot sell 2 tons per day into the shipping market. You cannot build pipeline systems for 2 or 3 biogas plants. And the problem is, nobody will build that infrastructure before the biogas plants are there. Nobody will build the biogas plants before the infrastructure is there. Typical chicken and egg problem. So what's needed policy-wise is, first of all, we must have security politically that the material is actually exportable. There have been export bans, for example, for palm oil. There have been export bans for minerals. There have been export restrictions for biomass, solid biomass in Indonesia especially. And nobody will invest in exporting biomethane production facility if there is no guaranteed exportability for that product. That's really key. Then we need low-cost pipeline access. Pipeline access in principle is already available in Indonesia and Malaysia, but the pricing mechanisms are not really clear. There are restrictions on exactly what the gas composition can be. There are limitations on what we call balancing gas volume. So you inject gas in one grid section, you take it out from another grid section. All of these things are not sufficiently regulated and allow the grid operators a lot of wiggle room to increase the cost and basically snatch the margin. So many projects are struggling with costing of pipeline use. That's really a huge problem. In theory, it should be possible, but there are a lot of loopholes that make it very difficult in reality. Then policy-wise, what we really also need is a guaranteed market during the development phase. So imagine we can build biogas plants near existing pipeline systems where, for example, the gas operator is obligated to buy a certain volume and then first mover gets volume first. That way we can start volume before full infrastructure is there. So for example, if we need liquefaction for LNG filling stations for ships to bunker them, before we can build that LNG terminal in the Straits of Malacca, we need 10 or so biogas plants at least to provide biomethane to that LNG station. If there were a government program to say, okay, we guarantee gas offtake for 10, 15, 20 biogas plants until these infrastructures can be built, that would provide the market security for investors to build these plants and then ultimately justify the construction of the LNG plant. But nobody will build the LNG plant before the biogas plants are there. Another issue for domestic markets is subsidies of fossil fuels. For example, in Indonesia, we have basically subsidized prices for domestic gas off-takers. Large industrial off-takers pay way below market price. We don't have the same subsidy for biogas. So of course, if we try to compete with subsidized natural gas using biomethane, it's impossible. They pay about 30% less than market price for natural gas. Then there is domestic market obligation for coal in Indonesia that also makes electricity artificially cheap. I'm not saying that's a wrong policy, that's a different topic. What I'm saying is biomethane should get the same incentive. And then we, of course, what we also need are tax incentives. Right now, especially in Indonesia, there are only tax incentives for very large investment projects. Biogas projects are usually below that threshold, and we have practically no true incentives there. So that would be good if we reduce the threshold for tax incentives in the renewable space, including biomethane. The key is creating policies that build volume to justify export capacity. That way, Indonesia and Malaysia can develop all of this potential. And once the potential is there, and let's say in 5 or 10 years, Indonesia and Malaysia really get serious in reaching their 2030, 2035 carbon targets, there is no reason why that gas cannot be used domestically. But why not export the gas as long as there is no real market domestically? So that's really the key. And relying on foreign markets for project development in Southeast Asia actually has been proven as a working concept before, because all the existing biogas plants in Indonesia have basically been developed under the CDM scheme. So that was a scheme in the early 2010s, where projects could be built in developing countries, selling the carbon emissions straight into industrial countries under an international regulatory scheme that was considered reliable. So we did not at all rely on any incentives in the countries themselves, like Indonesia or Malaysia. Those were only the locations for the investment and for the operations. The whole market was regulated and existed outside in the developed world. And that's basically the same now. We want to produce biomethane in countries where there's no demand and rely on clear regulations and markets that already exist in Singapore, Japan, Europe, Korea, and so on. And maybe with that, we can go on to Dieter and tell us more about what those markets look like. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Very nice overview of the production profile in Malaysia and Indonesia. I think it's worth reminding ourselves, as you have mentioned, that the use of biomethane is actually not new. It's already happening in other parts of the world, such as Europe. And furthermore, the technology is already available. And it's interesting to see that there's an untapped biomethane opportunity from the palm oil sector in Malaysia and Indonesia, but that the producers or potential producers are focused on the export market and how there is a low domestic demand as there are no viable domestic prices for such products. And I like what you said with regards to the contrast that Southeast Asia is actually drowning in biomass, but we do not know what to do with the methane that can be produced. Whereas for the rest of the world, there is demand for biomethane, but no feedstock. So with that, I would like to move on to Dieter. And meanwhile, for Thomas and Kevin, I see that there are some questions already coming in. You can take a look, and I will raise some of them during the Q&A segment, but you can take a look at those first. So Dieter, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christopher, and also welcome everyone, and Kevin and Thomas for sharing the overview of biomethane and also talking about the supply side of it in Southeast Asia, as well as the very large potential on the supply and production side of biomethane. And what I'll now talk about is really in terms of the demand side. And Thomas, you've also started talking about it in terms of the domestic demand and especially also the willingness to pay in some of these Southeast Asian countries like Malaysia and Indonesia is relatively limited, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But there is this significant export opportunity to markets like Japan, but especially also what I'll zoom into is the demand, especially in the relatively short term, coming from Singapore, which is really driving and giving this whole biomethane market in Southeast Asia a big boost in the short term. I will skip this slide because I think we've talked enough about what is biomethane, the different sources of it. I think important is when I talk about the demand for biomethane, is really about biomethane itself and not biogas, because the biogas ecosystem and the biogas demand is relatively well established. There's a lot of policies to actually also support that in markets in Southeast Asia. So when I'm talking about biomethane demand, it's really for the upgraded biomethane and not the biogas itself. If we look at it from a global perspective, there's plenty of countries and regions around the world that incentivize the production or the use of biomethane. And typically that can be done through carrot and sticks. So you have, for example, a carbon tax, which is a way to increase the willingness to pay for decarbonization technologies, including for biomethane. So carbon tax, as you know, or either through carbon tax itself or through emission trading schemes, that drives demand for those types of fuels like biomethane. In Southeast Asia, many countries are moving towards a carbon pricing, a compliance market, mandatory carbon pricing like a carbon tax. At this point, primarily Singapore has a sizable carbon tax in the region, and the other countries not yet. Other countries around the world, they've sometimes also set mandates. So for example, that a certain percentage of the gas system or for specific applications needs to come from biomethane. We don't have that in Southeast Asia. Other countries can also have a certain tax credit or subsidies, so financial incentives more on the production side of biomethane. Also, Southeast Asia does not have that. So overall, and with the exception of Singapore, which I'll come to in a moment, no countries in Southeast Asia have really policies in place to incentivize the demand for biomethane. And therefore, what we see in markets like Indonesia, Malaysia, but also Thailand, there is some voluntary demand for biomethane. Naturally, you have companies that have decarbonization commitments, or there's some voluntary demand for biomethane. But the willingness to pay for that is very low when we're talking about negligible volumes, or very small volumes. And therefore, if you really want this whole biomethane market to scale up, you need policies to support that, to drive the willingness to pay. And that's actually now what we're seeing happening, especially also when it comes to Singapore. Now, in terms of the different applications and demand, I think it has been mentioned in the presentations before me that biomethane is the same as natural gas, just coming from different types of feedstock and hence very different carbon intensity. But in terms of how you transport it and the different applications, it can therefore be used for exactly the same applications as natural gas. So what you see here is the natural gas use cases in Southeast Asia. So across Southeast Asia, actually many countries in the region are very gas dependent. And that is true if you look at electricity generation. So you can see here how much natural gas is being used when it comes to electricity production. So Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, but especially also Singapore. From a percentage point of view, Singapore is roughly 95% gas-based. So all of these countries are very gas intensive in the power sector. And naturally, that is therefore also then potentially a major application for biomethane. Number two is the industrial sector. What you see here is in terms of industrial heating, and on top of that, as Kevin also mentioned, there's other industrial applications, including the feedstock. But industrial heating is also a large demand driver for natural gas in the region. And then there's transportation. So if you look at it today, natural gas is not widely used for transport today in Southeast Asia, but naturally there is demand and potential in terms of using biomethane for road transport, but especially also for the maritime sector. Now, Malaysia, Indonesia, in terms of domestic demand, domestic volumes or domestic policies, there are several programs in place. I would say it's more related to biogas. So both Malaysia and Indonesia have mature ecosystems when it comes to biogas. Both countries also realize that there is significant potential for biomethane, but in terms of specific policies, they're not yet in place. An important element here is that both countries are aware of the export opportunity, but of course that some countries, Malaysia and Indonesia, are increasingly also dependent on LNG imports, and hence they're also looking at leveraging their feedstock and biomethane to reduce their future imports of natural gas, of LNG. And hence biomethane is a topic in these two countries for energy security reasons. And hence in the future, there will also be debate about, do we use those feedstock and biomethane for domestic reasons and or for export to Singapore? I mean, what I will argue is that the export to Singapore is actually a very good short-term opportunity for these countries because there is this willingness to pay, which I will talk about in a moment, in Singapore. And that can actually drive up the whole ecosystem also in Malaysia and Indonesia, which at some point will actually also support the availability in Malaysia and Indonesia while the willingness to pay in those countries emerges. So let's talk about Singapore, because as I mentioned, Singapore is really driving in the short term this demand for biomethane in the region. There is a higher willingness to pay. And why is that? First of all, because Singapore is very dependent on gas. Singapore is a large gas and LNG importer. Gas is used across multiple sectors. And gas is also important from an emission point of view. So what you see here is, for example, Singapore's emissions in industry and power. And you can see that natural gas is actually a relatively important driver also for emissions in Singapore, both in industry as well as in power, which is normal because gas is so important in Singapore's energy mix. And therefore also to replace part of those natural gas uses in Singapore with biomethane, and hence also reduce Singapore's emissions, given that natural gas is a large driver for Singapore emissions. That's where this all fits from a Singapore decarbonization point of view. There are two specific use cases that are very relevant in Singapore on the demand side. The first one is on the electricity side, and the second one is on the transport side. On the transport side, this is bunkering. And let me just talk about that for a moment before then doing a zoom on the electricity side. So on the bunkering side, Singapore is the largest bunkering market in the world, and plays an important role in terms of decarbonization of the shipping sector. Naturally, it's also dependent in terms of what happens with IMO regulations, as Thomas also highlighted. What we see also happening globally is that LNG is going to be an important decarbonization pathway for shipping, not necessarily bio-LNG, but LNG. And once you have those LNG part vessels, what we will then start seeing is that part of that LNG can be blended with bio-LNG, of course, also depending in terms of what happens with the IMO regulations. And therefore, Singapore will also be in a very strong position to play a role there. Other countries in the region as well. It's not just Singapore that is a big bunkering market, but that's going to be an important driver of biomethane across the region, again, depending what happens with the IMO regulations. We don't see massive volumes yet at this point on the demand side. There's a lot of interest. The volumes, the actual willingness to pay is not that high yet, given uncertainty on international regulations. But the potential in terms of volume is very sizable. Where we see larger volumes in the very short term, and that's therefore what I will zoom into, is on the electricity side in Singapore. And that is really driven primarily by data centers. So what's happening, I'll talk about that, is that there's two different tenders happening right now in Singapore that are closely related and actually driving the demand for biomethane. One is on the electricity side in terms of what is called a sandbox for biomethane imports, which is basically to allow electricity producers in Singapore to import biomethane. The electricity produced from that biomethane is then a renewable electricity produced in Singapore, and can be sold to various end users, but especially also to data centers. Now, why is there such a strong willingness to pay from data centers? Is because the data centers, I mean, first of all, they have decarbonization commitments, but especially also because there's a second tender happening right now in Singapore, which is a tender for new data center capacity, where there's a strong incentive to actually power those data centers, at least part of it, with electricity coming from biomethane. So there's those two tenders right now happening in Singapore, and it's those two tenders that are really driving the biomethane and the willingness to pay in Singapore, and hence supply from the region. And that's what I'll briefly talk about. So the first tender that is happening in Singapore is this biomethane sandbox organized by the Singapore government. This is currently ongoing. Submissions have already happened. The results should be out in the next couple of weeks. So what is this tender about for this biomethane? It's basically a tender to allow the GenCos, so the power utility companies, the gas-based power utility companies, to import biomethane and to use that biomethane and to basically offset part of their carbon footprints through this biomethane, so that they pay less carbon tax in Singapore. So there's a financial incentive for them. The other incentive is that they can then sell that electricity from that biomethane at a premium because it's renewable electricity. So I think this is an important one, is because it opens up this demand coming from the power sector in Singapore. And importantly, it's linked to this second tender, which I talked about, which is a tender for new data center capacity in Singapore. And as you know, Singapore has historically been a very large data center hub globally and in Southeast Asia in particular. But given space and power limitations, there hasn't been a lot of new data center capacity in the last 10 years. So therefore, this tender that is currently happening in Singapore for new data center capacity is relatively rare, and hence there's quite a number of players interested to participate in this data center tender. Now, as part of the tender requirements, there's actually a significant requirement on the energy side, is that at least 50% of the energy from the data center, for the planned data center, needs to come from what is called eligible green pathways, which includes biomethane, low carbon ammonia, novel fuel cell technology with carbon capture, low carbon hydrogen, vertical building integrated photovoltaic, So it's not specifically limiting the energy only to biomethane. There's a couple of options, but if you look at all these different options, actually biomethane is feasible in a shorter time frame compared to some of the other alternatives, is also cheaper than some of the other alternatives. So what you see is that a lot of the data center companies participating in this tender are actually particularly looking at biomethane to supply a large part of these energy requirements. So that's basically how it all fits together, is that you have this requirement on the data center side. The data centers therefore have a willingness to pay for the green electricity coming from biomethane. Therefore, the power utilities in Singapore can purchase those biomethane volumes from other parts of the world, especially also from Southeast Asia. So all this is currently ongoing. I mean, there's no molecules flowing yet, but at least this drives contracts, offtake discussions, and willingness to pay across this ecosystem. And all of these molecules at some point will need to get into Singapore to drive that export demand in Singapore. How do you get that biomethane into Singapore? Naturally, the most cost-effective way would be to leverage existing gas pipelines. So that's where countries like Indonesia and especially also Malaysia could have an advantage. But Thomas also mentioned about some of the challenges in terms of using those pipelines. So what you see is that a lot of players also tapping into other transport options, including CNG, but especially also in terms of using bio-LNG, whereby some of the players involved in these tenders are actually proposing to build liquefaction to liquefy, first of all, to buy aggregated volumes of biomethane in those countries, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Thailand, liquefy that and ship to Singapore, where in the shorter term, this can be then used for this sandbox and for the power sector. And of course, once you have that in bio-LNG form, you can also start serving some of that emerging demand on the bunkering side. Now, this is a zoom from Southeast Asia. In reality, it's especially countries like Malaysia and to some degree also Indonesia that are tapping into this export opportunity to Singapore. But you also have other countries actually also participating further away. Australia, even places like the United States, etc., have biomethane production, and there's also some of these countries are also involved in this whole opportunity, even if they're further away. And I think it's also important from an energy security point of view to have a diversified supply. So, but naturally, a lot of the volumes will come from the region, especially given the availability of the feedstock and the cost of transport compared to further away places. And that's really driving that nascent emerging ecosystem of biogas to biomethane upgrading, aggregation of biomethane volumes, and then the transporting side. So yeah, all of that is basically being formed right now. The biggest trigger, in my view, is these tenders that are happening in Singapore. At some point, there will also be other export destinations. I think a lot of players are already looking towards Japan, for example. But I would say in the short term, the biggest boost for this whole ecosystem is coming from Singapore. And that's basically what I wanted to share more on the demand side. And I'll leave it to Christopher to move us towards the discussion.
Thank you, Dieter, for the very detailed presentation on the demand side and the export opportunities from Malaysia and Indonesia. I think what's interesting for me is that you emphasize the point that biomethane can be a direct substitute to existing natural gas applications. Second, biomethane aligns with Malaysia and Indonesia's decarbonization ambitions and energy security concerns, while near-term export opportunities exist to the Singapore market. And I think the export to Singapore in the short term as an opportunity because of its willingness to pay is a very important point. And that it will actually help develop the ecosystem in Malaysia and Indonesia in the long run. And your focus on Singapore is very helpful for those of us seeking to understand Singapore's role in the development of the biomethane sector in Malaysia and Indonesia, as well as the use cases in Singapore. So thank you very much. And there are a lot of questions flowing in, and we will begin the Q&A portion of our seminar. Instead of asking a question myself, I think we have enough questions from the audience to go straight to the Q&A, to look at the Q&A panel. So let me see. Okay, so first of all, there's a question for Kevin. I noticed that Kevin has already answered some questions online, so I won't go into those. But Kevin, there's a question from Jabal Tay that from a carbon emission mitigation perspective, Kevin mentioned that there is both the benefit of capturing methane leakages and also the replacement of fossil fuel. How would that generally compare to pure play renewables like solar and wind? And also, from a calculation point of view, are there challenges in calculating the full supply chain emissions, given that it's potentially more complicated than pure play renewables? And second question from Jabal Tay, I think I will address this one to Thomas. I understand that palm oil mills can be used for biogas they produce for their own operations. In that case, what incentives or drivers would motivate them to sell the gas to third parties or to export it? Okay, so we'll go with these two questions first. And Dieter, if you like, you can jump in as well. So Kevin, can you go ahead first?
Yep. Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Jabal, for asking the question. I think when we look at both solar and wind, as well as renewable fuel side of the house, we're really looking at decarbonization on two different fronts, right? When you look at the natural gas use in Southeast Asia today, that amount for just the major economies, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, the amount of carbon emissions coming out from there is more than 300 million tons per annum. And when you think about biomethane, you're actually decarbonizing this, right? You're trying to displace this emissions that's coming out from our existing natural gas use. We are also building up solar and wind capacity in the region, and that's helping to support decarbonization of new demand, the increase in capacity that's needed by the region as we grow. So I would say that both have a role. The potential for biomethane is significant in the sense that we have a base load and peaker plants that we are trying to decarbonize right here and now, and that potential of decarbonizing that is very important and very significant. So I see it as two prongs. In any case, gas peaker plants and gas power plants actually help stabilize the system if you're increasing wind and solar capacity. Yeah. So in the second part of the question around the supply chain and accounting for the carbon, it's a technical problem. It's established and solved in Europe. In Southeast Asia, there's still a lot of enablers that needs to be built up, centralized registries, making sure that the owners of tracking tracing is being put on some of the grid operators and the entire ecosystem. But that will be built up in due course as long as we value the fuel at the end properly. Over to Thomas, maybe.
Yeah, Thomas, can you answer the second question? I guess it's a pretty short response. Thomas, you need to turn your mic on.
Sorry. The question was about palm oil mills' own energy demand, and with that in mind, whether there is any excess biogas or biomethane available. Unfortunately for the biogas industry, there actually is no real demand by the palm oil mills. So most of the energy demand is already renewable from burning fibrous biomass they have, so the mesocarp fiber to be specific, and some of the shells. So the POME and EFB are currently not used at all, and the palm oil mills usually don't need the energy from the gas potential that we can get from that. There are some cases, of course. So some palm oil mills, for example, have downstream processes like so-called kernel crushing plants, where they need roughly 1.5 megawatt of electricity. So that can be produced from biogas. But that's only 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 palm oil mills that need that. And other palm oil mills produce biomethane for their trucking or for their emplacement electricity demand. But that offtake is way below the potential for biogas, and also not very widespread. It's usually palm oil mills that build biogas plants for other reasons, for methane emission reductions, and then use the biomethane because they already have it anyway. But it would not be viable usually to build the biogas plant for those applications. So bottom line is the palm oil mills don't really need the biogas. Some of them use it, but the demand by the mills is way below the potential of biogas they can actually produce.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, I think what we have in Southeast Asia is that you have policies like a feed-in tariff in place, whereby these mills or other types of players can use the biogas for electricity production, also for heat. Some of that is then used for own consumption, as just mentioned. Part of that, as long as there is an electricity grid connection, can then also be sold, where then when you sell that electricity, you get a feed-in tariff. And that's basically an interesting kind of dynamic also in terms of with biomethane. Because as long as you have those feed-in tariffs, it basically kind of competes with biomethane because it gives an incentive to use that biogas and sell the electricity to the grid to get a feed-in tariff. So how these feed-in tariffs for biogas is evolving is actually quite important, because that also drives the willingness to pay for the competition also for that biomethane, and whether the upgrading of the biogas to biomethane is actually a viable business case. So what you see in some countries is that those feed-in tariffs are actually increasing for biogas, which makes it a bit more difficult actually on the biomethane side. And then there's also the off-taker risk, is that when you have those feed-in tariffs in place, some players are quite used to that. They've been doing that. The risk is considered relatively low because this is a kind of a government kind of program. Whereas if you upgrade to biomethane, there's some capex involved, and you sell then typically to a private customer. So there's also those considerations that come into play in terms of, are we going to take that risk to invest in this and also enter into a kind of an offtake agreement, whereas we currently have a feed-in tariff with a kind of a government scheme. Yeah.
Thank you, Dieter. Thank you, Thomas, for the response. I will now move on to a next question. It's actually addressed to Dieter, but I think all three speakers are welcome to respond to it. So it's by Ignatius Udaya. The question is, developing bio-LNG plants take a lot of time, and it won't be lots of volume in the beginning. Building LNG export terminal need a critical supply volume, so the most reasonable way is to use ISO tanks. Is the Singapore import terminal ready to accept small cargoes? My understanding is that they can only accept vessels LBV, not small ships. Not small ship carry ISO tanks. So basically, the question is centered around ISO tanks and how they can be used for the exports of the biomethane. So Dieter, can you go first, and then we'll have Thomas and then Kevin, if both of you are interested. Thanks.
Yeah, look, I mean, I cannot comment on the specific restrictions or availability on the Singapore side. I mean, what I do know is that several players involved in this sandbox are looking at those liquefaction, for example, from Malaysia, but also other countries. So it is part of the plans that is happening. So I do agree that it's actually relatively time-intensive, risky, capex-heavy business model to build that liquefaction in those countries, and there's definitely risks involved. I mean, I think that's also why you have other players looking at other transport modes. Naturally, pipeline would be the easier one if the capacity of those pipelines can really be used. So pipeline would be easier, less capex intensive compared to building liquefaction. Another option is to bring it into bio-LNG form, but blend it with conventional LNG. So if you have cargoes coming from certain places of origin, sending the LNG to Singapore anyway, to blend parts of those cargoes with bio-LNG. So this is also being planned and is a more cost-effective way than building liquefaction.
Yeah. So just very quickly, I should ask you also to explain to the audience what is an ISO tank, in case some of them do not know what these are.
Thomas,
Yeah, should I jump in here? Yeah. ISO is in this case referring to basically ISO standards. So it's not isolation or insulation. Basically, it means you have a standard shipping container sized rig with an LNG tank installed or CNG tank. And those tanks can then be loaded to standard container ships. So it's an ISO size container. And also, I'm not really familiar with the Singaporean regulations, but indeed I have heard that there's some restrictions about transporting LNG tanks within Singapore, I think, if I remember correctly. But those are regulatory restrictions. Those are not actual engineering problems. So it's basically just a matter of adjusting regulations if you want to change it. The tricky part is, the question was the size of liquefaction plants being very big, and that's why ISO containers might make more sense. The problem is also for ISO containers, you first need to liquefy the gas. So liquefaction plants you need either way. The reason, the point where ISO containers make sense is where you have liquefaction plants, for example, somewhere located, let's say in North Sumatra, and then you consolidate gas from several biogas plants in one central location, and then from there you can deliver ISO container-sized LNG tanks, or you load directly to ships. Bottom line is we still have the difficulty that we need liquefaction infrastructure, and for that we first need to have a number of biogas plants. Unless we build very small liquefaction plants, which are also available, but much more costly in terms of per ton of LNG to operate. So that's why indeed the low-hanging fruit is injecting gas into the pipeline and then delivering it to existing LNG plants, where the natural gas and biogas would be taken from the pipeline and basically liquefied, as is already happening now. That's the lowest hanging fruit. And again, because I see some of the questions, just let me clarify again. Biomethane and natural gas is exactly the same molecule. So it's biogas, 50% CO2, 50% methane roughly. You take out the CO2, you're left with 90, 95, 97% methane, and that's exactly the same molecule that you have in the pipeline. So when we talk, for example, about ships and bunkering, blending bio-LNG and LNG, that's not because of a technical restriction. It's the same molecule. They won't even know whether it's biomethane or not. It's just an economic question. can they meet their emission targets by just bunkering LNG, or do they need some bio-LNG to reach their emission targets, because the emissions from bio-LNG are lower than LNG. So it's really all economical and certification matters. It has nothing to do with technical integration problems.
And maybe if I could chime in, just building on what Thomas and Dieter mentioned, in long run, we will have to make things more efficient and economic, we will have to build up the ecosystem of enablers that allow to some extent a book and claim or trading of that attribute, because in reality, the molecules are the same as Thomas mentioned. And we already have existing LNG ecosystem and the entire trading ecosystem and infrastructure is already in place. So biomethane essentially can come under some of those existing trades, physical trades that are already taking place in the region.
Yeah, thank you very much. I will move on to the next questions. We have quite a number of questions coming in. So that's good. It means that people want to learn from the experts. And maybe we can start with a question from from Rachel Hu. A question that just came in. Rachel Hu is asking, understand that one of the key challenges to unlock biomethane potential from palm waste is to do with logistics. Palm is generated at remote palm oil mills, thus usually require consolidation of a few mills to give the economy of scale. There is also regulatory constraint around transporting palm out of mills. She was wondering what are the key enablers or solutions to unlock the upstream logistic constraints. So maybe Thomas and Kevin, would you like to answer that? Kevin, maybe if you have something to say, would you like to go first?
No, I'll let Thomas go for this.
Okay, yeah. So Thomas, this is a logistic question.
So I mentioned in the beginning, in Southeast Asia, we are primarily active as a technology provider, EPC, for biogas and biogas upgrading plants. And that's a very common request we get from developers to build large-scale centralized biogas plants where they consolidate biomass from several locations. Correct. Logistics in biogas is always a huge issue because usually it's wet biomass, so you have somewhere between 40 to 90% water in the mix that you don't want to truck around. I'm not really aware of legal restrictions to, for example, truck around POME. There might be, because it's wastewater, so there's some, discharge monitoring happening and so on. But that's not really a thing because nobody will truck POME. It's not viable. If you have to truck POME a couple of kilometers, the diesel or gas consumption, the trucking fuel consumption will be higher than the gas potentially actually delivering. So POME digestion must happen on site. Other biomass that's more solid is transport worthy. So for example, empty fruit bunches could potentially be transport worthy. Famously, chicken manure is transport worthy because it's very low moisture and high energy density. Grain, of course, would be transport worthy if you want to use it for biogas. But normally, consolidation is a problem because of logistics cost. And also in biogas production itself, there is not much economy of scale. Once you reach a size of, say, 2 or 4 megawatt electrical equivalent, you get into repetition. So the palm oil mills are already big enough to build a biogas plant that's basically at scaling limit. So it's not really necessary to consolidate biomass for large biogas plants. What the issue is the gas utilization, especially liquefaction or methanol production. That's why what you do consolidate is the gas. In my opinion, the approach should be biogas plants at the different mill locations and then consolidating the gas itself either by CNG truck or pipeline to have some centralized liquefaction location somewhere.
Thank you, Thomas. I'll move to the next question by Ran Wu. It's a question regarding standards and certification of biomethane. So what are the key standards and certification challenges for biomethane today? And how can biomethane produced in Southeast Asia gain recognition in Singapore and other importing markets as a renewable fuel? So Dieter, would you like to go first? And then perhaps Thomas and Kevin, if you have anything to add, let me know.
Yeah, sure, I can start.
Sorry, before you continue, can you point again to the question? I didn't quite catch it.
Okay. So the question is, what are the key standards and certification challenges for biomethane today for them to be exported to Singapore and other markets? Okay. Yeah. So Dieter?
Yeah, I think it's one of the key challenges right now in terms of these certifications, and especially also because if you look at it also from a Singapore government perspective, I mean, the biomethane imports are going to be used to reduce the carbon tax in Singapore for players involved. And it's also very important to avoid double counting between different countries. There's not a lot of G2G arrangements specifically on this topic. I think sometimes there are the European Union is being looked into as an example, but the situation is very different compared to the EU. It's a very challenging situation, I would say, to find a good solution at this point for the imports of biomethane into Singapore. ISCC EU is typically referred to as the standard to follow for these initial volumes for imports. I think at some point there's going to be discussion, is that really the right standard to follow? Should Singapore develop its own standard, for example? Because a lot of the specifications for ISCC EU are really for an EU specific context. And yes, it's maybe if you need to pick something, it's probably the easiest because it is relatively well known and adopted, but it's still specifically designed for Europe. So that's a bit a challenge. Huh?
Okay, Thomas or Kevin, would you like to go first, Kevin?
Yeah, maybe for me to just jump in to say that there are eventually synergies between the land-based use, so and eventually the IMO framework when it comes out. And so some of these standards eventually needs to be harmonized, but unfortunately at this point there's just a void, and EU happens to be the biggest market consuming biomethane already with the ecosystem established, so ISCC EU is being referenced. I understand that Australia have their own accounting methods as well. When it comes to carbon, there's quite distinctly different when it comes to carbon associated with renewable fuels. Quite distinctly different from ISCC EU. So Singapore eventually will have to evolve some kind of standards. But indeed, this is probably a point for regional collaboration, given that there's such a huge biomethane potential in Southeast Asia.
Okay, Thomas, before you answer, I have a quick follow-up question based on the last statement you made, Kevin, because it ties to a question by Ferdos Hamza. He's from Circular Transition Partners. The question is that with so much focus on palm, what other waste feedstock in Southeast Asia are considered a priority for biomethane feedstocks in the region? So beyond what we talk about today with palm oil, what other sort of resources do we have across Southeast Asia?
Maybe on that, we've done quite a bit of work going beyond palm. So there is actually in Thailand, for example, there are several plants that uses like waste cassava starch, and there you have sago starch and so on as well. So there's a fair bit of different waste streams from your industrial agri-food value chain. the reason pommet is such a big thing is because of the sheer potential and the fact that they are already aggregated and concentrated, as Thomas mentioned.
Okay, thank you for that. Thomas?
Yeah, just following up on the second question first quickly. Correct. The pommet and empty fruit bunch focus is because you have no logistics, everything already in place, no real competing use case. So it's really jumping at everybody who knows anything about biogas. Beyond that, there is huge potential as well, as in practically any other, especially tropical country, except that's very scattered, right? So none of those other things remotely comes to the volume that we have in the palm oil individually. In aggregate, it might be the same, maybe bigger. I don't know. I don't have the statistics. The typical feedstocks would be manure of all kinds. So chicken droppings, cattle manure, swine manure, and so on. But those only make sense if you have large-scale animal farming. Then agricultural residues in Southeast Asia, especially, and India, especially rice straw is a big thing. But it's also very difficult to digest in biogas because of its composition. I don't want to dive into details now. So you cannot build a biogas plant just for rice straw. That's, well, at least I will say that. Some people will say they can. So there is huge potential, but all the other biomass sources require logistics, consolidation. Sometimes you have to pay for it. You depend on a lot of different suppliers, so the projects are more complex. But for those, the potential is the same or maybe even better than in any other countries that does not have palm oil. It's just that here everybody is almost distracted by palm oil because it's just so tempting. In Indonesia specifically, municipal solid waste biofraction is very topical right now, but it's also difficult to use in biogas because of all the contamination you have. Now to the certification part. There are certification schemes already. ISCC EU was mentioned. There's also other ISCC standards like ISCC Plus, for example. A lot of countries are looking into doing their own standards, but I personally am discouraging from that. And I'm much more promoting an approach where existing standards are adopted to also accommodate, for example, Singaporean requirements. Why? Because once we get biomethane into the international value chain, we will very soon see it even virtually being delivered to all sorts of markets. And then it's very important that you have a unified standardized certification scheme and don't require every biogas plant to fulfill 5 different standards just to be internationally tradable. So correct, ISCC EU right now is catering for EU, but the special thing why it's so complex is because it is catering for 20 different biomethane markets in the EU. And just generally speaking, I don't see any reason why it should not be possible to add 1, 2, 3, 4 markets outside the EU into that certification scheme in principle. Like we could just include the requirements from Singapore, and if the mill wants to access that market, they tick 3 extra boxes, for example. Another important thing is, and that's lacking in Southeast Asia, most of these schemes require a regulated registration system for biomethane injected into the grid to avoid double counting. And in the EU, we already have such a register now, just started a few months ago. The reason why it's necessary is because once you mix it with natural gas, you cannot tell it apart. And if you want to inject in Dumai and extract in Singapore, for example, you have to make sure that nobody else is buying the same volume of biomethane from the pipeline. So that's why you need one single national registration system. And also there, I encourage Southeast Asia to negotiate or to see if it's possible to use the same registration platform that's already been established for the European market. Why? If you do that, suddenly bio-LNG produced here is immediately exportable into the EU. You already have it under the register. If you produce biomethanol from that biomethane, and the biomethane had been registered on that platform, the biomethanol is immediately recognized renewable. I'm sure there are a lot of regulatory details that make it difficult, but it's definitely worth considering. So yeah, challenges, but they exist, they are solvable.
Okay, thank you very much for the detailed response. We are actually 5 minutes over time, but there's actually one interesting question that came in with regards to finance. That's something we haven't quite touched on. So I will ask it, and perhaps you can keep your responses very short. This is to all the three speakers. So can the panelists talk about how you see the whole ecosystem being financed? The ecosystem being the project upstream, midstream, the logistics, infrastructure, etc. Will they be all coming from private financing, or are there other ways to raise capital? So simple way to look at this question is where's the money coming from to do all these projects? Perhaps Dieter, I'll let you go first, and then Kevin, and then Thomas.
Yeah, I can start. From the different projects that I'm aware of, it's actually coming from private financing. I think this could potentially definitely be a nice segment for some of the multilateral development banks. And I'm sure they're somehow involved, but at least the project that I've seen is private finance driven. I think in order for this to be financed, the offtake agreements are critical, and that's why the link that I also presented between the GenCos in Singapore with the data centers, that agreement coupled with the offtake agreement between the GenCo and the supplier and importer of the biomethane, those are critical. Because that's where you have the largest kind of volumes, a specific time period, pricing formula. So those two contracts are critical. Then I think once those are in place, the one kind of aggregating the volumes towards selling to the GenCo in Singapore. I mean, all of these kind of other contracts are also very critical, but are basically kind of a secondary kind of contracts driven by what is happening in terms of Singapore. So all of these contracts are basically required to make this whole ecosystem financeable.
Yeah, so just I won't repeat what Dieter mentioned. At the end of the day, having bankable contracts, offtake agreements is the basis by which everything gets financed. What I would offer is that I think there are a lot of opportunity to utilize infrastructure midstream that is not yet fully utilized, whether it's liquefaction facilities or pipeline infrastructure or even gas storage infrastructure. There is abundance of such infrastructure that is not at capacity yet, and biomethane offers that opportunity. So that's already in place. We don't have to finance too much new infrastructure, and biomethane can be phased in because you're not going to start with a huge amount of new quantity coming in place. So I think this is an advantage vis-a-vis other forms of low carbon vectors where a lot more new infrastructure needs to be invested into.
Thank you, Thomas. You have 1 minute.
Okay. I tend to disagree a little bit regarding infrastructure. So definitely there's infrastructure investment needed in the pipeline system if you want to avoid trucking CNG. And that's something that international development banks could step into, because that infrastructure is usually government-owned or state-owned companies, and that's what these development banks are usually comfortable financing. In Germany, for example, grid connections are paid for by the gas companies and the costs are distributed on the gas price. So it's not part of the project cost usually. So that's very important. Finance-wise, the big challenge is that biogas projects are usually below the threshold attractive for project finance. We are somewhere in the range $5 to $20 million, and usually the international financing organizations or project financiers only start looking at projects when the credit financing volume exceeds 25 million. So that's a problem. And that's also why most projects are privately financed right now. So I believe there are projects by development financing banks now to try and address that issue, but I'm not aware of any actual projects having been financed that way. So it's almost always corporate finance by parent companies or private equity investors.
Okay, thank you to all three of you for those insightful answers. I'd like to thank our speakers, Kevin, Thomas, and Dieter, for making time to share their expertise with us today. Also, thank you to my ISEAS colleagues who has been working behind the scenes. Finally, thank you to you, the audience, for tuning in. This has been a rather technical webinar, but I am sure you found it very rich and informative. And please feel free to reach out to the speakers if you have questions that were not addressed online. The seminar will be posted on the ISEAS Yusof Ishak YouTube channel soon, so you can all rewatch it there. And finally, we have come to the end of the seminar. Thank you very much and goodbye, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.